The silence in apartment 7B had become a living entity, one that followed Eliza Morgan like a shadow. She stood at her window on the 27th floor, watching the first snowfall of December dust Manhattan with white. 17 floors below, people moved like ants, their umbrellas blooming like sudden flowers against the grey sidewalks. Not one of them looked up. Not one of them knew she existed. Behind her, the sleek apartment gleamed with untouched perfection, glass, chrome, and emptiness. Her laptop sat open on the dining table she had never used for dining, the cursor blinking at the end of her resignation letter. After 12 years as senior editor at Apex Publishing, she had typed the words that would end her career in exactly 4 minutes and 38 seconds. The diagnosis sat heavy in her coat pocket. 3 words that had shattered her carefully constructed life: progressive hearing loss. The specialists gave her 2 years, maybe 3, before silence would become her only companion. Eliza pressed her palm against the cold glass, feeling the vibrations of the city she would soon stop hearing. For someone whose entire identity revolved around words, language, and communication, the irony was almost poetic. Her phone buzzed. She ignored it, knowing it would be Thomas, her boss, demanding to know why she hadn't shown up for the quarterly review meeting. What could she possibly say? "Sorry, I'm too busy having an existential crisis because I'm going deaf." She turned from the window and looked at the bookshelves lining her walls, thousands of carefully edited words that had defined her life. Words she had polished to perfection for authors who received the acclaim while she remained invisible. Words that would eventually become inaccessible to her in their spoken form. The cursor continued to blink, patient and unrelenting. "Enough," she whispered to the empty apartment, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. Was it already changing? Could she already hear less than before? Instead of hitting send, Eliza closed the laptop. She walked to her closet, pulled out the suitcase that had gathered dust since her last work conference 3 years ago, and began to pack. She had no destination in mind, only the overwhelming need to be somewhere, anywhere else, when the silence finally came for her. Somewhere where no one knew Eliza Morgan, the meticulous editor who caught errors no one else could see. Somewhere where she could disappear before the world disappeared from her ears. As she zipped the suitcase closed, her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Thomas. It was a notification from a real estate app she'd forgotten she had installed months ago during a late-night bout of insomnia. New listing: isolated cabin with ocean views. Echo Bay, Maine. Perfect writer's retreat. Eliza stared at the screen. She had never written a word of her own. She had always been the invisible hand that shaped others' stories, never the creator. But something about those words, Echo Bay, tugged at her. An echo was a sound returning, persisting even when its source was gone. Without allowing herself time to reconsider, she clicked Contact Owner and typed a single question: "When can I move in?" The cabin stood like a sentinel at the edge of the world, perched on a granite cliff overlooking the Atlantic. Its weathered cedar shingles and faded blue shutters had witnessed a century of storms. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles down the coast, and the small town of Echo Bay was a 20-minute drive along a winding road that hugged the shoreline. Eliza stood in the driveway, her city boots sinking slightly into the gravel, and inhaled the sharp scent of pine and salt. The December air bit at her cheeks, colder and cleaner than Manhattan's. Behind her, the taxi that had brought her from the small regional airport was already disappearing down the road, leaving her truly alone for perhaps the first time in her life. The key in her hand felt impossibly heavy. Martha Winters, the elderly owner who had rented her the cabin over a surprisingly brief phone call, had left it under a conch shell by the door as promised. It's not much," Martha had warned in her down east accent that stretched vowels like taffy, "but it's got what matters: heat, running water, and a view that'll make you believe in God, even if you don't." Eliza didn't believe in God, but as she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she understood what Martha meant. The main room was dominated by a wall of windows facing the ocean, now dark and churning beneath a steel-gray sky. The view knocked the breath from her lungs. The interior was simple: pine floors worn smooth by decades of footsteps, a stone fireplace that anchored the space, mismatched furniture that somehow worked together. It wasn't the minimalist perfection of her Manhattan apartment, but it felt more honest somehow. Eliza dropped her suitcase and walked to the windows. Outside, the wind sculpted the pines into bent silhouettes against the darkening sky. Waves crashed against the rocks below, sending spray 30 feet into the air. She couldn't hear the impact over the double-paned glass, but she could feel the faint vibration through the floorboards. A note sat on the kitchen counter, handwritten in looping script. "Welcome to Echo Bay. Wood stacked outside. Groceries in the fridge to get you started. Town's not much, but Ellis's General has what you need. Come by my place when you're settled. Yellow house past the lighthouse. Martha." Next to the note sat a small wicker basket containing a loaf of bread, local honey, a jar of blueberry jam, and a bag of coffee. The simple kindness from a stranger made Eliza's throat tighten unexpectedly. She unpacked quickly, arranging her clothes in the bedroom's pine dresser and placing her laptop on the desk facing the ocean. Her medication, small pills that might slow the progression but couldn't stop it, went into the bathroom cabinet, out of sight. As darkness fell, Eliza built a fire following the instructions in a handwritten guide she found on the mantel. The flames caught slowly, then with increasing confidence, sending warmth and flickering light across the room. She stood back, oddly proud of this small accomplishment. In New York, heat had been something that simply happened at the press of a button. The silence here was different than in New York. It wasn't the artificial quiet of soundproofed walls and noise-canceling windows. It was alive, punctuated by the crack of the fire, the distant rhythm of waves, the soft moan of wind around the eaves. Eliza closed her eyes and focused, cataloging each sound, storing it in her memory for the day when memory would be all she had. Her phone buzzed. A text from Thomas. "Whatever this is, Eliza, you can't just disappear. The Patterson manuscript is due next week." She turned the phone off without responding and placed it in a drawer. Patterson and his mediocre thriller could wait. For the first time in 12 years, Eliza Morgan was unreachable. Outside, the first real storm of winter began to gather strength. Inside, cradled by the cabin's sturdy walls, Eliza felt something unfamiliar stir within her. Not quite peace, but possibility. "You're holding it wrong." The voice startled Eliza so badly, she nearly dropped the axe. She whirled around to find a man standing at the edge of the clearing behind her cabin, a border collie, sitting attentively at his side. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival in Echo Bay. 3 weeks of solitude broken only by brief trips to Ellis's General Store and one awkward tea with Martha Winters. The isolation had become a comfortable blanket, one Eliza wrapped tightly around herself, until now. The man stepped forward, his movement causing the dog to rise expectantly. He was tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. Early 40s, perhaps, with dark hair threaded with silver at the temples and eyes the exact color of the winter sea. "Sorry," he said, his deep voice carrying easily across the clearing. "Didn't mean to scare you, but you'll hurt yourself swinging like that." Eliza bristled. "I'm doing fine." The pathetic pile of wood chips and awkwardly split logs at her feet suggested otherwise, but pride kept her chin high. After the heating oil had run unexpectedly low 3 days ago, she'd been determined to master the wood-splitting skills that Martha had assured her were simple enough once you get the knack. The man raised an eyebrow, glanced at the mangled wood, and wisely chose not to comment directly. "I'm Daniel Calloway," he said instead. "I take care of Martha's rental properties during the off-season." The dog whined softly, and he added with a small smile, "And this is Echo." "Echo?" Eliza couldn't help asking. "Named for the bay." He patted the dog's head. "She showed up during a storm last year. No collar, no chip. Nobody claimed her." Eliza nodded, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance. Hair stuffed under a knit cap she'd bought at Ellis's, Martha's borrowed oversized flannel shirt over her thermal, cheeks flushed from exertion. 3 weeks ago, she wouldn't have been caught dead looking so unkempt. "Eliza Morgan," she offered, setting the axe down. "I'm renting for the winter." "I know." At her surprised look, he added, "Small town, news travels." Echo trotted forward, stopping a respectful distance from Eliza, head tilted questioningly. Her black and white coat gleamed in the winter sunlight, and intelligent eyes studied Eliza with what seemed like genuine curiosity. "She's very well behaved," Eliza said, uncertain how to interact with the dog. Her apartment building in New York hadn't allowed pets. "She's particular about people," Daniel replied, watching as Echo cautiously approached Eliza. "Takes her time deciding who she likes." To Eliza's surprise, Echo moved closer and gently pressed her nose against Eliza's hand. The sensation, cool, slightly damp, alive, sent an unexpected shiver up her arm. "Well," Daniel said, looking genuinely surprised, "that's unusual. She doesn't warm up to strangers quickly." Eliza found herself crouching to the dog's level, tentatively extending her fingers to stroke the soft fur. Echo leaned into the touch, eyes half closing in what appeared to be contentment. "About the wood," Daniel said after a moment. "Would you like some help? I'm heading to check on the Roberts place next, but I've got time." Pride told her to refuse. Practicality and the memory of how cold the cabin had been that morning won out. "That would be helpful," she managed. For the next half hour, Daniel demonstrated the proper technique for splitting logs, his movements efficient and practiced. Eliza watched, noting the mechanics, the angle of the blade, the positioning of the hands. Language might have been her expertise, but she had always been a quick study with any kind of pattern. When he handed the axe back to her, she mimicked his stance and swing. The log split cleanly in two. "Fast learner," he remarked, something like respect flickering in his eyes. By the time they finished, a respectable pile of split wood stood ready for the fireplace. Echo had settled on a patch of sunlight, watching them work with serene interest. "So," Daniel said as he helped stack the last of the logs against the side of the cabin, "Martha mentioned you're a writer." Eliza hesitated. She'd let Martha assume that, finding it easier than explaining her actual situation. "Not exactly," she finally said. "I'm an editor. Was an editor." Daniel nodded, not pressing for elaboration. "Well, this is a good place for words one way or another. Something about the rhythm of the tides helps thoughts find their shape." The observation was unexpectedly poetic, coming from a man who looked more comfortable with an axe than a pen. Eliza found herself studying him with new interest. "Do you live nearby?" she asked. "Lighthouse Keeper's cottage." He pointed north along the cliff. "My grandfather was the last official keeper before it was automated. Families kept the maintenance contract since." A companionable silence fell between them, broken only by Echo's soft snuffling as she investigated something interesting in the snow. "I should get going," Daniel said eventually. "Robert's family will think I've forgotten them." He whistled softly, and Echo immediately trotted to his side. "If you need anything, I'm just up the coast. Martha has my number." Eliza nodded. "Thank you for the wood-splitting lesson." The corner of his mouth lifted in a half-smile. "Anytime. Winter's long here." As Daniel and Echo disappeared into the pines, Eliza realized something disquieting. For the past hour, she hadn't once thought about her hearing loss. The constant awareness that had shadowed her since the diagnosis had temporarily lifted. That night, with a fire crackling robustly in the hearth, Eliza opened her laptop for the first time since arriving. Instead of checking her emails or the work she'd abandoned, she opened a blank document. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long moment. Then, slowly, she began to type. The silence in apartment 7B had become a living entity. The weeks began to blur together, marked by the rhythm of tides rather than deadlines. January brought fierce storms that hurled spray against the cabin's windows and howling winds that tested the old structure's bones. Eliza grew accustomed to the symphony of weather, often sitting by the fire with a mug of tea, letting the tempest wash over her while she wrote. The words came haltingly at first, then with increasing fluidity. She wasn't writing anything structured, just fragments, observations, memories. Sometimes she wrote about New York and the life she'd left behind. Sometimes about Echo Bay and its peculiar beauty. Sometimes about the looming silence that waited for her, patient and inevitable. Her hearing hadn't noticeably worsened, though sometimes she found herself turning up the volume on the small radio in the kitchen or asking Martha to repeat herself during their increasingly regular afternoon teas. The local doctor had refilled her prescription without asking too many questions, though his eyes had lingered on her chart with professional curiosity. February arrived with diamond-bright skies and brutal cold. The bay partially froze, creating a surreal landscape of ice sculptures when the tide went out. Eliza had taken to walking the shoreline each morning, camera in hand, documenting the ephemeral beauty that would be reshaped with each new tide. It was during one of these walks that Echo found her. The dog appeared suddenly around a bend in the shore, bounding across the rocky beach with obvious delight at discovering Eliza. She skidded to a halt, tail wagging furiously, eyes bright with canine joy. "Hello, Echo," Eliza said, surprised at how pleased she felt at the unexpected company. "Where's your human?" As if in answer, a whistle sounded from farther up the beach. Echo's ears perked, but she made no move to leave, instead nudging Eliza's hand with her nose. Daniel appeared a moment later, breathless, his face flushed from the cold. "Sorry," he called as he approached. "She took off when we got out of the truck. Should have known she'd find you." Eliza scratched behind Echo's ears, earning a look of bliss from the dog. "We're becoming friends, I think." Daniel studied them, something unreadable in his expression. "Seems that way." In the 6 weeks since their first meeting, Eliza had seen Daniel occasionally around town and once at Martha's when they'd both been invited for Sunday dinner. Their interactions had been pleasant but brief, marked by a mutual respect for each other's privacy. "What brings you to this part of the beach?" Eliza asked, realizing that Daniel's lighthouse was in the opposite direction. "Actually, I was looking for you." At her raised eyebrow, he added quickly, "Martha mentioned you were photographing ice formations. I thought you might want to see the sea caves. This is the only time of year they're accessible, when the tide's out and the bay's partially frozen." Eliza hesitated. Her morning walks had become a cherished ritual, a private meditation. Sharing it with someone else felt like a small surrender. Echo nudged her hand again, dark eyes somehow imploring. "How far?" Eliza asked. "Half-mile north. We can be there and back before the tide turns." The caves were more spectacular than Eliza could have imagined. 3 cathedral-like chambers carved into the cliff face, their walls lined with intricate ice formations that caught the winter sunlight and broke it into rainbows. Icicles larger than her arm hung from the ceiling, creating a crystalline forest that tinkled melodically in the gentle breeze. "It's extraordinary," she breathed, the words forming white clouds in the frigid air. Daniel nodded, watching her reaction with evident pleasure. "Local legend says they were used by rum runners during Prohibition. More likely it was just local fishermen storing their catch, but the smuggler story makes better tourist bait in the summer." Echo darted between the ice columns, her black and white coat a stark contrast against the blue-white landscape. Eliza took dozens of photographs, trying to capture the otherworldly beauty. "You have a good eye," Daniel commented, glancing at her camera screen. "You see details others miss." "Occupational hazard," Eliza replied. "I spent years looking for things that didn't belong. Misplaced commas, inconsistent character traits, plot holes. Must make it hard to just enjoy a book." Eliza smiled ruefully. "Sometimes. But when you find one that's flawless, where everything fits exactly as it should, there's nothing better." They fell into conversation more easily than Eliza expected. Daniel told her about growing up in Echo Bay, about learning the lighthouse keeper's trade from his grandfather, about the changes he'd seen as fishing declined and tourism grew. Eliza found herself sharing stories about the publishing world, the authors she'd worked with, the satisfaction of helping shape a manuscript into its best form. She didn't mention her diagnosis or her abrupt departure from New York. Something in Daniel's demeanor suggested he sensed there was more to her story, but respected her right to reveal it in her own time, or not at all. As they walked back along the beach, Echo running ahead to investigate interesting shells and driftwood, Daniel asked, "Have you been writing? Martha seemed convinced you came here to work on a book." "Not a book," Eliza said after a moment. "Just writing for myself. That counts." The simple validation warmed something inside her. In New York, writing for yourself would have been considered a hobby at best, a waste of time at worst. "Maybe," she allowed. "It feels different from editing, harder in some ways. There's nowhere to hide when it's your own words." Daniel nodded. "Like being the lighthouse instead of the keeper." The metaphor struck her as surprisingly apt. Exactly like that. When they reached the point where their paths would diverge, Eliza found herself reluctant to end the conversation. Echo seemed to share the sentiment, pressing against Eliza's legs as if anchoring her in place. "I'm making clam chowder tonight," Daniel said abruptly. "Old family recipe. There's always too much for one person. If you wanted to come by." He trailed off, looking suddenly uncertain. Eliza thought about her quiet cabin, the half-written pages waiting on her laptop, the evening stretching empty before her. "What time?" she asked. The lighthouse keeper's cottage was everything Eliza had unconsciously expected. Practical, sturdy, and filled with evidence of a life spent in conversation with the sea. Fishing nets hung decoratively on whitewashed walls. Weathered buoys served as bookends on wooden shelves. A telescope stood by the window facing the bay. What surprised her was the piano that dominated one corner of the main room. Not a grand instrument, but a well-loved upright with sheet music open on its stand. "You play?" she asked as Daniel took her coat. "Badly," he admitted with a self-deprecating smile, "but persistently. Good company during winter storms." Echo greeted Eliza like a long-lost friend, circling excitedly before leading her on a tour of the cottage, bedroom, study, kitchen, as if showing off her domain. The dog's obvious enthusiasm made Daniel laugh. "She's never like this with visitors," he said, shaking his head. "Usually hides under my desk until they're thoroughly vetted." "Maybe I smell interesting," Eliza suggested. Daniel's eyes met hers briefly. Maybe you are interesting. The chowder was extraordinary, rich with fresh clams, potatoes, and cream, seasoned with herbs Eliza couldn't quite identify. Family secret, Daniel said when she asked. My grandmother would haunt me if I revealed it. They ate at a table by the window, watching the last light fade from the winter sky. Conversation flowed easily between them, punctuated by comfortable silences. Eliza couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so at ease with another person. After dinner, they moved to the worn leather sofa near the fireplace. Echo settled at their feet, sighing contentedly. Daniel poured them each a glass of amber liquid that burned pleasantly going down. Local apple brandy, he explained. Ellis's brother-in-law makes it. Technically illicit, but the sheriff's his best customer, so... Eliza laughed, feeling the warmth of the fire, the brandy, and something else she couldn't quite name spreading through her. So Echo Bay has hidden depths. Most places do, Daniel replied, his voice softening. Most people too. The moment hung between them, fragile as an icicle. Why did you really come here, Eliza? He asked finally. To the edge of nowhere in the dead of winter? The question should have felt intrusive, but somehow it didn't. Perhaps it was the brandy or the firelight, or the way Echo had rested her head trustingly on Eliza's foot. Whatever the reason, she found herself wanting to answer honestly. I'm going deaf, she said, the words falling from her lips for the first time since the diagnosis. Progressive sensorineural hearing loss. Eventually, I won't hear anything at all. Daniel's expression didn't change to pity as she'd feared. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. How long? He asked. Before complete loss? 2 years, maybe 3. It's already starting, certain frequencies first, high pitches, children's voices. Eventually everything. Eliza took another sip of brandy. I came here because I needed to hear the ocean before I couldn't anymore. I needed to remember what waves sound like. The admission hung in the air between them. Eliza waited for the awkward platitudes, the well-meaning but empty reassurances that always followed revelations of illness. Instead, Daniel set his glass down and stood. Come with me. Puzzled, Eliza followed him through the cottage to a door she hadn't noticed before. It opened onto a narrow spiral staircase. The lighthouse? She asked. He nodded, grabbing a heavy flashlight from a hook by the door. Watch your step. It gets slippery. The climb was longer than she expected, the metal stairs cold beneath her fingers as she gripped the railing. Daniel led the way, the beam of his flashlight illuminating each step. Echo stayed behind, apparently uninterested in this familiar journey. When they finally emerged at the top, Eliza's breath caught. The lighthouse's lamproom was a marvel of glass and brass, the powerful beam sweeping methodically across the dark water. Outside, a narrow catwalk encircled the structure, offering a 360-degree view of Echo Bay. It's automated now, Daniel explained, raising his voice slightly over the hum of the machinery. But I still come up every night to make sure everything's working. Some habits die hard. He opened a small door leading to the catwalk. The February wind hit Eliza like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Daniel stepped out confidently, offering his hand. After a moment's hesitation, she took it. The world spread out around them in breathtaking vastness. Below, the bay stretched dark and limitless, meeting the horizon in a line so perfect it seemed drawn with a ruler. Stars blazed overhead with an intensity Eliza had never seen in New York, their light seemingly amplified by the cold. The lighthouse beam swept past them, momentarily illuminating their faces before continuing its vigilant circle. But it was the sound that overwhelmed her. The wind, the waves, the rhythmic mechanical hum of the lighthouse equipment, all combined in a symphony more complex and beautiful than anything Eliza had ever heard. Close your eyes, Daniel said, his mouth close to her ear. She obeyed, tightening her grip on the railing as the world disappeared. Listen, he continued, his voice a warm anchor in the darkness behind her eyelids. Really listen, not just with your ears. Eliza concentrated, feeling the vibration of the waves through the metal beneath her hands. The pressure changes as gusts of wind swept around the lighthouse, the subtle rhythmic trembling of the entire structure as the mechanism rotated. Sound isn't just what you hear, Daniel said. It's what you feel, what you remember, what you imagine. His hand covered hers on the railing, warm despite the bitter cold. Even in silence, the ocean keeps moving. The light keeps turning. Nothing really disappears. Eliza opened her eyes to find him watching her, his expression open and unguarded, in a way that squeezed something in her chest. I'm not saying it won't be hard, he added softly. Just that there are other ways to listen. In that moment, perched above the world with the wind tearing at her clothes and the stars burning overhead, Eliza did something she hadn't done since receiving her diagnosis. She leaned forward and kissed him. His lips were cold at first, then warming against hers. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing gently across her cheekbone. The kiss deepened, becoming a conversation without words, an acknowledgement of something neither had expected to find in this remote corner of winter. When they finally broke apart, breathless and smiling, the lighthouse beams swept between them, illuminating the mist of their exhaled breath mingling in the frigid air. "We should go back down," Daniel said reluctantly, "before we freeze." As they descended the spiral staircase, Eliza realized something had fundamentally shifted. The fear that had driven her from New York, the terror of facing her future alone, had been replaced by something else. Not hope exactly, but possibility. Echo greeted them at the bottom of the stairs, tail wagging as if they'd been gone for days instead of minutes. Eliza crouched to scratch behind the dog's ears, receiving an enthusiastic lick in return. "She loves you," Daniel observed, hanging the flashlight back on its hook. Eliza looked up at him, still kneeling beside Echo. "Is she the only one?" The question hung between them, honest and vulnerable in a way Eliza would never have allowed herself to be 3 months ago. Daniel's answer was to kneel beside her, taking her face in both hands and kiss her again, slowly, thoroughly, with the patience of a man who measured time by tides and seasons rather than minutes and deadlines. Echo, apparently approving, pressed against both of them, creating a circle of warmth on the cold cottage floor. Spring arrived in Echo Bay with an explosion of green. Wild violets carpeted the woodland floor behind Eliza's cabin. Seabirds returned from their winter migrations, filling the dawn with raucous cries. The bay, freed from its partial ice cover, danced and sparkled beneath the strengthening sun. Eliza stood on her porch, coffee mug in hand, watching a pair of ospreys circling above the pines. 4 months had passed since her arrival, 4 months that had transformed her in ways she was still discovering. Her hearing had deteriorated slightly. High-pitched birdsong sometimes eluded her now, and she had to ask Daniel to repeat himself occasionally when they were walking on the beach, with the surf crashing beside them. But the progression was slower than her doctors had initially feared. Each day of sound a gift she no longer took for granted. Her laptop chimed softly, indicating a new email. Probably her editor in New York, who had been surprisingly understanding about her abrupt departure, once Eliza had finally explained her situation. She had continued to edit freelance, just one manuscript at a time now, chosen with care, approached with a newfound appreciation for the luxury of working with words. But her own writing had flourished too. What had begun as fragmented observations had gradually coalesced into something larger. Not quite a memoir, not quite fiction, but a hybrid form that felt true to her experience. Her editor had read the first 100 pages and called it extraordinary. The word had made Eliza smile, thinking of the sea caves and their crystalline beauty. Echo's bark announced Daniel's arrival before Eliza saw his truck coming up the drive. The dog had taken to splitting her time between the lighthouse cottage and Eliza's cabin, somehow intuiting when Eliza needed solitude for writing and when she needed company. "Morning," Daniel called as he climbed out of the vehicle, a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. Echo bounded across the yard to greet Eliza, receiving her customary ear scratch before racing back to Daniel. "You're early," Eliza said, smiling as he mounted the porch steps and kissed her lightly. "Tide's perfect for what I have planned," he replied, with a hint of mystery. "Got your swimsuit?" Eliza raised an eyebrow. "The water's still freezing." "Trust me?" She did, with a completeness that would have terrified her New York self. 3 simple words that had become the foundation of whatever was growing between them, deliberately unnamed, but undeniably real. An hour later, they stood on a secluded beach Eliza had never visited before. Towering cliffs prevented access from land, except by a narrow, winding path that Daniel navigated with the confidence of long familiarity. Echo raced ahead, disappearing around rocky outcroppings only to reappear moments later, urging them to hurry. "My grandfather showed me this place when I was 10, Daniel explained as they picked their way across the sand. "Made me promise never to bring tourists. Said some places deserve to stay sacred." Eliza understood the magnitude of the trust he was showing her. "Fiat, here I am." He took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not a tourist anymore, Eliza." The beach ended at what appeared to be a solid rock face. Daniel led her closer, then pointed to a narrow opening partly concealed by an overhanging ledge. "We have to time it perfectly with the tide," he explained. Too high and the entrance is underwater. Too low and we miss the show. What show? Eliza asked, intrigued despite her initial skepticism about swimming in the still, frigid Atlantic. Daniel just smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of his eyes in the way that never failed to warm her from within. You'll see. Or rather, you'll hear. They changed into wetsuits behind separate rock formations, laughing at the awkwardness of peeling the neoprene over cold skin. Echo watched their preparations with canine patience, apparently content to wait on the beach. She doesn't like swimming in confined spaces, Daniel explained when Eliza asked if Echo would join them. So how she'll guard our stuff? The water hit Eliza like an electric shock, driving the breath from her lungs despite the wetsuit's protection. Daniel steadied her with a hand at her elbow, letting her acclimate gradually. Slow breaths, he advised. Your body will adjust. He was right. After the initial shock, the cold became manageable, uncomfortable but not unbearable. They swam toward the narrow opening in the cliff face, Daniel leading the way. Stay close, he said as they approached the dark entrance. It's wider than it looks, but keep one hand on the wall. Eliza followed him into the passage, fighting a momentary claustrophobia as darkness enveloped them. The sound of their movements echoed strangely in the confined space, amplified and distorted by the rock walls. Just as Eliza began to wonder how much farther they needed to swim, the passage widened suddenly, opening into a cave large enough that she could no longer see the ceiling in the dim light filtering through the water. Almost there, Daniel said, his voice reverberating oddly. Sir, can you hear it starting? At first, Eliza wasn't sure what he meant. Then she noticed it, a faint musical tone, like someone running a wet finger around the rim of a crystal glass. The note grew stronger as they swam deeper into the cave, joined by others in an eerie, beautiful harmony. What is that? She asked, her own voice sounding strange to her ears. The locals call it the sea organ, Daniel replied. Something about the shape of the cave and the way the tide moves through the rock formations. It only happens during certain tide conditions, maybe a dozen times a year. As they reached the back of the cave, the music swelled around them, a complex alien symphony created by water and stone. Eliza floated on her back, letting the sounds wash over her, through her. The notes vibrated in her chest, her sinuses, her skull, bypassing her ears in a way that made her suddenly understand what Daniel had meant on the lighthouse catwalk. Sound wasn't just what you heard, it was what you felt, what you remembered, what you imagined. It's incredibly beautiful, she whispered, not wanting to interrupt the natural music. Daniel floated beside her, their hands finding each other beneath the surface. I wanted you to experience it, to know that even when your hearing is gone completely, places like this will still be playing their music. You'll just have to listen differently. Tears mixed with the salt water on Eliza's face. Not tears of grief or fear, but of a profound gratitude that defied language, the very tool that had defined her professional life. They floated together for what might have been minutes or hours, time becoming meaningless in the womb-like embrace of the musical cave. Eventually, Daniel squeezed her hand gently. The tide's turning, he said. We need to head back while the passage is still clear. As they swam toward the entrance, Eliza tried to commit every note of the sea's symphony to memory. She focused not just on the sounds themselves, but on the feeling of them resonating through her body, the way they seemed to bypass her ears entirely and speak directly to something deeper within her. The return journey through the narrow passage felt different, a transition back to the ordinary world that seemed both too soon and somehow right. When they emerged into the open bay, the bright spring sunshine momentarily blinded Eliza. Echo greeted their return with enthusiastic barking, racing along the shoreline as they swam toward the beach. Later, wrapped in thick towels and sitting on sun-warmed rocks, they watched the tide continue its ancient rhythm, the same force that had carved the musical cave over countless millennia. Thank you, Eliza said simply, leaning her head against Daniel's shoulder. For what? For showing me a different way to listen, for helping me see that what I'm losing isn't the whole story. Daniel's arm tightened around her. When my grandmother was dying, he said quietly, she told me something I've never forgotten. She said, the lighthouse doesn't stop guiding ships just because they can't see it in the fog. Some lights work differently in different conditions, but they never stop shining. Eliza considered this, watching Echo dig enthusiastically in the sand nearby. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She would have liked you, Daniel replied. She had no patience for self-pity, but endless compassion for real grief. She believed the difference mattered. The distinction resonated with Eliza, In New York, she had been drowning in self-pity, seeing only what she would lose. Here in Echo Bay, she had learned to grieve honestly for her hearing, while simultaneously discovering new ways of experiencing the world. "I need to tell you something," she said, straightening to look at Daniel directly. "My publisher wants the manuscript by August." Daniel nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "That means going back to New York." "For a while," Eliza admitted. "There are meetings, edits, publicity plans to discuss." "I understand. But then I need to decide where to live permanently," she continued. "Where to set up my life for what comes next." The unspoken question hung between them. 4 months was both an eternity and an eye blink. Too soon for certainties, perhaps, but long enough for the roots of something enduring to take hold. "Echo Bay has a good audiologist in the medical center," Daniel said slowly. "She comes from Portland once a week. Martha mentioned it to me. Just information you might want to have." Eliza smiled at his careful approach. "Is that your subtle way of asking me to stay?" A flush crept up his neck, visible despite his tan. "Maybe not so subtle." "The cabin rental ends next month," Eliza pointed out. "Martha would sell it to the right person. She's been talking about moving to her daughter's place in Vermont." "Are you a realtor now too?" Daniel laughed, the sound carrying across the empty beach. "No, just a man who's fallen in love with a woman who brought spring to Echo Bay in the middle of winter." The words, plain and honest, struck Eliza with their simple truth. There had been no dramatic declarations between them, no promises beyond the next day's plans. Yet something profound had grown in the spaces between their conversations, their shared silences, their gradual discovery of each other. "I haven't decided anything yet," she said, wanting to be as honest with him as he was being with her. "My whole life was in New York. My career, my friends, however distant I let them become." "I know," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "And I'd never ask you to choose between your life there and possibilities here. That's not love. That's possession." The distinction mattered, Eliza realized. In all her past relationships, there had always been an element of compromise that felt like surrender. This felt different, an invitation rather than a demand. Echo trotted over, dropping a piece of driftwood at their feet with hopeful eyes. "Your dog wants to play," Eliza observed, grateful for the momentary lightening of the mood. "Our dog," Daniel corrected with a smile. She decided that a while ago. The simple statement contained multitudes, acknowledgement of what had already been shared, space for what might come next, acceptance that some choices were made by hearts rather than minds. Eliza picked up the driftwood and threw it along the shoreline. Echo bounded after it, her joy in the simple game evident in every line of her body. "I used to think silence was the enemy," Eliza said, watching the dog retrieve the stick. "Now I'm starting to think it might just be a different kind of conversation." Daniel's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with familiar ease. "Whatever you decide about New York, about Echo Bay, about us, just remember what you heard in that cave today. The sea organ? That all of nature is constantly speaking. Sometimes we hear it with our ears, sometimes with other parts of ourselves." He squeezed her hand gently. "The world never goes silent, Eliza. We just learn new languages." As they walked back along the beach, Echo racing ahead to scout their path, Eliza felt the weight of the future, with all its uncertainties and inevitable losses, balanced by the unexpected richness of the present. The manuscript waiting on her laptop, the community she'd found in Echo Bay, the man beside her, patient and kind and unafraid of difficult truths. She didn't know yet what she would choose when the time came to decide. New York with its familiar challenges and professional opportunities. Echo Bay with its natural beauty and slower rhythms. Perhaps some third path not yet clear to her. But for the first time since the diagnosis, the choice felt like a beginning rather than an ending. The coming silence, gradual, inevitable, but no longer terrifying, would change how she experienced the world but not her place within it. That evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the bay in shades of amber and gold, Eliza opened her laptop and typed the final lines of her manuscript. "The silence, when it finally comes, will not be empty. It will be filled with everything I've learned to feel instead of hear, the vibration of waves against rock, the pressure of wind against skin, the rhythm of a dog's breathing against my leg, the shape of a loved one's laughter, seen rather than heard. The world will continue its ancient conversations. I will simply listen with different parts of myself." She saved the file, closed the laptop and looked out at Echo Bay, this place that had become so much more than a temporary refuge. Whatever happened next, she had found her voice in the approaching silence, And in finding it, she had discovered that some stories don't end, they simply change language. My friends, we've come to the end of the story. Did you like it? What lesson can you bring to life from this story? Leave it here in the comments. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and watch this video that's playing on your screen. This story will impact you. See you next time.